Hello, this is Euan, and today I'm going to be talking about form configuration in OpenCRVS. So, a bit of history. Originally, in the first versions of OpenCRVS, you could use a JSON file to edit the registration forms. And configuring registration forms is one of the key selling points of OpenCRVS because every country has different questions that they want to ask in different orders. So what a developer could do is work in JSON. There'd be a block for each form, a block for each page in the form, and a block for each input field. And you could edit properties of that input field, labels, validations, etc. In JSON. But we found that that's quite a difficult thing to do for developers. Quite easy to make a syntax error. And so we deprecated the JSON in favor of a form configuration user interface in OpenCRVS 1.0, and we maintained that until 1.2, and we stopped because there are so many different configuration possibilities that it got to be very, very difficult to quality assure. And for example, some of these fields are absolutely mandatory, such as first name, last name, gender, date of birth. And so you couldn't edit them, but then people would want to change position of certain fields, and that was very difficult to do, especially with some things like we've got dynamic addresses. So addresses dynamically populate across all the forms in various locations, and managing all of that with the hierarchy of fields on a page just became such a headache for quality assurance. And so we decided this is probably going to be quite a sinkhole of developer time. And so we reverted back to allowing developers to configure the form using code, but we didn't want to go all the way back to JSON. Instead, we went to TypeScript. And that makes it a lot easier for a developer, a lot more difficult to make a mistake because we can be type safe with all of our properties. So now in OpenCRVS 1.3 onwards, form configuration is once again a developer activity in TypeScript. So each one of these fields is a function, so a TypeScript function. And I'm going to be showing you today how to configure the forms using TypeScript. So one really important thing to mention is that you can make as many changes to your form configuration as you like while you are in development mode. But once you go into production, once you start registering people for real, then you cannot change the form configuration from that point. This is not a technical constraint, it's an operational constraint. So when you think about it, let's say I wanted to change my form after going live and I added in a new mandatory field. Then all of the pre-existing registrations in the system, there would be null data where that field is now required, and therefore what would we default that value to in the database for those already existing registrations? We couldn't assume to default it to anything, and therefore if you were to download one of those existing records into a correction form, all of a sudden you can't submit the correction because you've now got a mandatory field that you can't complete because you don't have the beneficiary in front of you, you don't know what to put in that field. Therefore, you could get yourself in real trouble if you started adding mandatory fields after going live. Now, what you could do is you could add optional fields. There's nothing to stop you doing that, and that should work absolutely fine. Or you could make a previous mandatory field now optional. That's not going to be a problem. But just be aware that ideally you should not be changing your form once you're live in production. Now we are working on an issue that will allow this, because perhaps over the years you might want to change what your form contains. Regulatory changes may force you to make changes to the registration form. So we are aware that we need to have this capability in time. And we have this issue here, 3798. And if you're interested in that, then I recommend subscribing to this ticket. And then at some point in the near future, we'll release this functionality, the ability to change your form configuration in the future. All right, so let's proceed to configure the form. Right, first of all, let's take a brief look at the directory structure in the country config repo, source form folder. So in the source form folder, you can see a number of directories. You can see directories for each vital event, and that's generally where we will be working. We'll be working in one of these vital event directories: birth, death, marriage, etc. We'll also be working in the addresses, but we'll come to that later. So inside the birth directory, one of these event directories, you'll notice that there's an index file. And the index file is essentially your form represented as code. So if you scroll down here, you can see that there's an object containing what we call an array called sections. Now, sections are pages in your form. So you can see, if I bring the form back up, there's a section called the introduction section, which is this information here. So, information, not introduction, information. This is the information section. And then the next section, next page, is called the child's details. So I can contract that, and here's a section, child. So I can contract that, and the next page is informant. I can contract this, and the next page is the mother, like so. Okay, so each of these sections are pages in your form. So inside, you'll notice there's one section called the registration section, which is hidden, and that's just a place where we store the kind of hidden IDs for each registration. So for example, it could be the tracking ID or the birth registration number or other identifiers like that. They are kind of in this hidden section. You leave that one alone, don't touch it, just leave it alone. You can do whatever you like with the other sections. You know, you've got information, you can decide to have that page or you can delete it. But there are some mandatory sections you have to have, like you have to have a page for the child's details. You have to have a page for the mother, the father, the informant, documents. You can't get rid of those pages. Those are essential. But you can change all the fields. You can change the vertical order of the fields. You can change, you can add new questions. You can hide some questions. Now, some fields are required, like for registration to work, you're going to need to have the name of the child. There's various ways you can have the name fields. You can have first name or last name first, then first name. You can even have a middle name field, but generally when you look at the country config example, if I was to do this, then any space for any subsequent name separated by a space in the first name field, that would be anything here would become a middle name. So you could have as many names as you like, and it will take this as the first name, and these will be middle names. So you don't need to have a middle name field, but if you want one, you can have one. Then you've got date of birth. These are essential fields. Another really essential field is the place of delivery. This is the place of birth. And in this form field, you can choose from one of the seeded hospitals that we have in the database, or a residential address. And I'll come back to addresses and place of birth later, because this is a mandatory field. And addresses are handled in a specific way. You'll notice that the same address fields are replicated all the way across the form in different sections. So we use a decorator function to kind of make that a single configuration location, which is then duplicated over and over again in other parts of the form. But all the other questions, you can decide to have these or not. You can have selects, you can have as many different options as you want. You can change the order. So to just show you how this works, I'm going to go into the index file for birth, and let's go into the child section, and let's move the type of birth question above the attendant at birth question. Just a very basic change. I'm just going to change the vertical order of these two fields. So if you go into the code and you expand the child section, you can see each form field is a function, and if you scroll down, you'll see these are very basic functions that don't require any parameters at all. I've got birth type, I've got attendant at birth, I've got weight at birth, which are these bottom three. If I was to take the birth type function, cut it and paste it above the attendant at birth function, and then save the file, and then go in here back to the app and just refresh the page, what it will do is it will load the new form configuration from the country config repository. And now when I go into the form and scroll to the bottom of the child's page, you can see the order of the fields has now changed just by me moving the functions up and down within the section. One of the other things you can see in form configuration is groups. So it's possible to have multiple sub pages. So if I could in the child section make 3 or 4 pages. So say one page would just have one, like the name, date of birth, the next page would have place of birth, type of birth, if I wanted to. And they all would all those sub pages, all the data would be collated into the main section. And you could do that with groups. So you can have as many different groups as you want, sub pages of a section. So that's what groups are. And all of the input fields are inside this fields array. So I've shown you how to move fields up and down. If you don't want any of those fields, you can just delete them. But if the field is required, there'll be a reason why we've had this required. It'll be because of the Euan standards for registration. So wouldn't advise you delete any required field. It could have unexpected consequences, but anything which is not required you can remove. Now when it comes to informant's details, we've got email required here, and phone number is not required. This is one of the ones that you can change. You don't have to have email or phone number. It's just that we've decided that email will be the method of communication. So if you're using emails as the main method of communication between OpenCRVS and your beneficiaries, then you want to make sure that users enter an email address. If you don't want that, you can just make that. You don't have to make it mandatory. So, for example, let's change that. So if I go to the informant section and I look for the email function, registration email, I can change that required property from true to false. So you can just click into each function and you'll see things like this. You'll see the name of the field. You'll see what type it is. It could be text, could be select, could be many different things. You'll see that there's a label that you can change. The label will be pointing to a content key inside the content JSON, which we'll come to in a moment. You'll notice a required property. You'll notice what the initial value should be. What's the kind of text that's in that field. Maybe by default you want to have some text in there. And you'll see that you've got a validator operation you can change. So these will be functions which will validate the input. So for example, if I don't do a valid email address, I'll get an error message. You'll see a prop called conditionals, and conditionals is making the field display depending on the value of another field, for example. So you can see that we're using a conditional for these fields. If I've chosen mother is the informant, then I don't need to ask all the information about the mother. But if I choose, because there's a specific mother section coming up, so I don't need to ask all that information on this page. But if I chose, say, grandmother, then you'll notice, oh look, I've got lots of fields that are now visible. So we're using conditionals to do that. We're saying, if the value of informant relationship type is equal to mother or father, then don't show any fields, otherwise show the fields. So that's what the conditionals array does. You'll notice a very important property called mapping. Now you should leave that alone. You shouldn't edit the mapping property. Mapping tells the back end what to do with this data in terms of when that data is prepared to be sent to the APIs in the back end. How should it be sent? How should it be formatted when we're retrieving it back from the APIs to display into the field? What should be the handlebar that is used on a certificate for this field? Those are the three things that the mapping function does, mapping property does. So just leave the mapping alone. You don't want to touch that at all. So you can see I've just made a change here. I've made email not required. I've saved the file, and if I refresh the page, and I go back to the informant details page, you'll now notice that field is no longer required. So these are examples of the kinds of changes you can make if you want to make one of these fields mandatory or not. So I am going to now show you how do you add in new questions. That say you've got a question that you want to ask that we're not asking. How can you add it in? Well, to add in a custom question, there is an example at the top of the birth form. You can see that it's commented out, import create custom field example from the custom fields file. So let's take a look at that. That's up a directory level, and you'll see this file called custom fields. So here we can see, here is a custom field example. This question is saying, what's your favorite color? Just a basic, example question. So if I commented this in, copied that function, and let's say, just for argument's sake, I'm going to ask for that the person's favorite color after I've asked for the attendant at birth. So I'll just paste that in there, that function in there. Okay, create custom field example. And now if I go back to the form and refresh the page, you will see there's now a question, what is your favorite color, rendering in the form. So I want to change that. I don't obviously want to ask what your favorite color is, but for example, I'm going to ask a question which is going to ask the user if the user is late, if the mother or father is late at registering their child, you may remember when we talked about application settings, there are a couple of properties to define how much the user has to pay for the registration. So if you register the birth within, say, 30 days of the birth, then you get the registration for free. If you register it between 30 days and 365 days, in this country you have to pay. And if you register after 365 days, you have to pay some more. And this is a kind of to encourage parents to register their children on time. So a late registration is it's not legal, so there must be some reason for it, and so we want to have like a field which says reason for late registration in our form. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the child's details, we're going to get the date of birth, and we're going to compare the date of birth to today's date, and we're going to get the, if I just log out and show you the we're going to get the application setting for delayed registration time. So I'm going to log in as a sysadmin to show you what I mean. You might remember this from the application settings video. So you can see we have a value for delayed registration, which is 1 year. So I'm going to go to this config and I'm going to pull that 365 days. And I'm going to compare today's date to the birth date and 365 days from the birth date, and determine if the beneficiary is registering the child late. And if they are, then I'm going to show a question which says reason for late registration. So this is quite a good example because I'll be using many of the features of form configuration that you need to know. So how to add a conditional on this question. So I'm going to add it in here. After date of birth, I'm going to add in a custom field which says reason for late registration. So I'm going to reuse the example that I have. So I'm just going to rename that to a function which will say get reason for late registration. That's the name of the function. So the function's saying, get me this form field and put it in here. Get reason for late registration. Okay, so I'm changing the name of that function. And okay, get reason for late registration. And you need to change the field name. So that every field name must be unique. If you have field names which are duplicates on a page, you'll get an error because this is essentially the ID for the data point. You'll get a warning saying you can't have duplicate IDs, field names. So I'm going to call this field name reason for late registration, all in camel case, all one word. This is a variable, so you can't have any spaces in the field name. And you you have to kind of edit the field ID. The field ID is a dot separated string, and this is used in order to get the value to go into a certificate and generate what we call the certificate handlebar. So you have to look at the form and make sure that you're in the right section, so where you want this field to go. So it's in the child section, so it would be the birth.child. Then you have to choose which subpage, and there's only one subpage in our form configuration, the child view group. Like I said before, you can have multiple subpages, so you need to pick up that hierarchy. So in this example, I'm just keeping the same hierarchy. So a birth, well, the field's going to go into the same location as this custom example. So I don't need to make any changes here. Birth.child view group, that's fine. But if I was making another field in the death form, then I would change that. And I'm going to do that later because I'm going to ask the same question in the death form. So I'll show you me changing that later. So I've now got a field called reason for late registration. And I obviously need to change the label on the field. So I'm going to add a label. Now, labels are what we call message descriptors. So they are using the format.js library, which is internationalization library. So every single bit of text in the application is localizable in any language you like. So in order to find say for example the French value for that text, the application takes the ID for the text, it checks what language is the user currently viewing OpenCRVS with, and then retrieves the actual message, the actual text from a JSON file. So the JSON file, there's another video all about content configuration. You may have seen that already, but there's a JSON file called client.json, and that's where all of the copy needs to go. And you'll notice each one of these bits of copy starts off with an ID. And then you see the language option in English, and if you've got French, you'd see that duplicated and maybe French in another object for the down. So I'm going to create. I need to create a new content key in the app. So I'm just going to try and find where here's where all the form fields are kind of, the copy for the form fields is added. It's just to try and be tidy. I'm going to put this label in the same place in this JSON. Just makes it easier to find. So I'm going to create a new ID in here, and I'm going to call it form.customfield.label.reason for late registration birth, because I'm going to have another label when I add this to the death form. So you add the ID in, and then you can type in the text that you want to display as the label for that field. So in this case, I'm going to say reason for delayed registration. And I'm going to have the same label in the case of death. So I'm just going to add, duplicate the field and change the ID, reason for late registration, death. So this is my label. And so I'm going to go back to the custom fields function, and I'm going to change the information here. So it is going to be like this. So I've now got the correct ID. I've got a description. The description is used if you use a content management system. So you can leave this blank if you don't want to add a description. It's kind of a helpful description that if you're going to get all the text translated, then this is a guide to the translator about what this text is meant to represent. So a form field that asks the reason for a late registration. And then default message is what you would see in that field if something goes wrong with the API to generate the text. So it's like a fallback, basically. So I've changed the label and I've saved the file. And so now if I refresh the page, I should see that field now with the new label on it. There we go. Reason for delayed registration. Wonderful. Now I don't want this field to be here. I want it to be further up. I want it to be appearing directly beneath the date of birth. So when the user enters in a date, then I want this field to show underneath whether or not, so, and then do the conditional logic to check, is this date delayed or not. So I'm going to go back to the index file. I can see in the child section, this is the birth date function right here. I can see I want to put my question in this space. So I'll just cut it from where it was before and paste it here. And that will move the question up the page. Now, you can see a comment here saying place of birth fields will render here. So I need to make a change in where the place of birth fields will render now that I've moved my question directly before this comment. And that's because, as I said before, addresses are decorated. They're duplicated in many different places. So I'm going to jump to addresses for a moment and then come back to complete editing this field. So addresses are duplicated in various parts of the form, so that you don't have to keep configuring selects for them over input fields for them over and over again. So for example, I'm on the mother's page. I've got the mother's address. Here you can see it here, country. The way that I've configured it is I've got country, province, district. These are the seeded location levels. So I've got 2 location levels after the country. And then I've got a lot of custom input fields after that. Now, I said in the video about how to configure administrative structure that these selects are kind of, you want them to be standardized. So you want beneficiaries to select the value rather than type it. Sorry, staff to select the value rather than type it, because they could make a spelling mistake and that could mess up analytics and interoperability for addresses if you allow the user to manipulate the hierarchy. The hierarchy has to be fixed. So we want this kind of structure of address to be replicated wherever it's used without any changes. So if I go to the fathers section, you'll see exactly the same structure for address on the father's page. And also when we talk about the place of birth, if the place of birth happens in an address, then the structure is exactly the same. So in the code, we have one location where all these addresses are configured. And the configuration will say after which field on the page should these addresses render. And now that I want to move that get reason for delayed registration after date of birth, I need to look at the part of the code that affects where this field renders and change the preceding field ID. So that will mean that the address will still render, but this time not after date of birth, but after my new get reason for delayed registration question. So if you expand the addresses folder, you'll see an index file. And in the index file, you can see a couple of really important configuration locations. The first one is admin levels. So this number must be changed if you're having, depending on how many selects you have for your admin levels. So the country is excluded, but I've got 2 admin levels in my country. I've seeded 2 levels in the database. But if you were to look at my administrative structure video, you'll see that for Ethiopia there are 3 levels that I'm seeding. So there'd be 3 selects for Ethiopia, for example. So you've got to change that number from 2 to 3. That's the really important prop to change. If you're having more than, or for however many levels of selects that you require, up to 4. I think 4 is the maximum. So you can change it 1, 2, 3, or 4. That's your choice. The next really important configuration is the default address configuration array. And this basically tells you after which preceding field should this addresses render on each page. So you can see that it's currently configured that after the child birth date, that's where the place of birth inputs render. And on the informant page, you can see after a line, there's a line called a separator. You can split your forms up visually with lines, with paragraphs of text. You can do lots of different sorts of UI components. It's after this line that the address renders for the informant. So I'm adding in a custom field. My custom field is going to be called reason for late registration. So I need to change this place the preceding field ID for the place of birth from child birth date to reason for late registration and save that. And now if I refresh the page, then the place of birth fields will still render. I won't have broken anything. But you'd get some, if I didn't do that, you'd get some funny rendering issues. I think probably reason for delayed registration wouldn't render here, it'd probably render after the addresses. So that's just one of the things to bear in mind, that the vertical location of all the addresses is controlled in this index file. Now, how do you change the address fields themselves? Well, there's another file called address fields, and you really rarely need to amend anything here, but there's comments above each of these functions which tells you if you should touch these or not. Most of them will say don't edit these functions, just leave them alone. So just scroll down until you get to a function which is telling you you can edit it. This one here, get address fields. So this is the function which renders all of the address fields. And you can see that it looks very similar to the index file or a function for any form field. Here's the country select, and then you can see this function get admin level selects. So that's the function which is checking how many admin levels you have and then rendering selects using options from the database. So you should never edit anything above that line, just leave that alone. But after that line, you can do whatever you want. So you can choose to have as many different inputs as you like. I recommend using a very similar approach to what we've done here, because we've done a number of tricks to use minimal code, but you could, if you didn't want to have one of these address lines, you could just delete them. So you could delete any of these objects if you didn't want to have them. Postcode. This one is the number, street number. Or you could repurpose them in any way you like. So you could do anything you want after the get admin level selects function. So essentially, as I said before, these three selects you can't customize, but everything after that you can customize. Right, so now I have my form field in the right location. The next thing for me to do is to control its visibility. So work on a conditional based on the value of the date of birth. So let me go back to my custom function. I've got a array here I can change. So what can I do with conditionals? Well, you can see some examples of what conditionals look like if you go back and look at this file. There's a folder called common, and you can see default validations, default conditionals, and these are some objects which give you examples of how to write conditionals. So if you look at the form and you go to the mother's or the father's page, for example, you see this checkbox says father's details are not available. If I check that, all the fields disappear apart from one which says why, or the reason. What's the reason? So you can see that there's a reused details exist conditional. So action, what's going to happen? Well, everything's going to hide if the details exist checkbox is false. So there you can see if details do not exist, then hide everything. So that's the conditional, which is controlling all of the inputs on this page. So that's the kind of expression we're going to reuse. We're going to say hide the fields if blah blah blah, the date of birth and the delayed registration date. If you're registering within the expected time period, then we'll hide the question. So I want to copy that block and use it in my custom field, but I need to change the expression. So what do I change it to? Well, I want to get the config property from application settings. So how am I going to do that? So when it comes to conditional logic, there are 4 different things, different properties you have access to for any kind of conditional. The first property is the values property. So the values property is basically the value of any other question on the current page. So on the child's page, the values property is equal to all of the entered values in any of the input fields on this page, the child's page. So for example, the value of first name would be Euan. So values.firstname would be equal to Euan. The second property that you have access to in conditionals, and you'll notice a few examples of this, is draft data. So draft data is the values on every single page all together in one draft. So you'll notice when you kind of exit a form, it's asking if you want to save it. This is you saving all the information into a draft. So we use draft data as the object that contains all of the input across all of the pages. So if you are writing a conditional that depended on the value entered by the user on another page, then you use dot notation to access that section. So draft data dot section dot value. So you'll notice those 2 examples there. Now there's 2 other properties you can use. The third property you can use is user details, and that will give you information about the actual staff member who's entering information into the form. So you can have questions related to that staff member themselves personally, or react based on the user's role, for example, show different questions depending on their role. That has been a requirement in some countries. So that's user details. And the fourth property you have is offline country config. So that is basically a property that contains all of your available configuration, application settings, and all of that is available offline to you. So if your connection drops while you're entering data into the form, you've still got access to all that data. So that is a useful database to get things such as the delayed time period setting. So how can I see that offline country config property to see what it looks like? Our application is a React.js application. It's a React.js application which started being written in 2017. So it uses a number of now a little bit legacy React components. One of them is called Redux State Management. and you know, things move very, very fast in the front end world, and Redux these days is probably not that common in React applications, in new applications, but in legacy applications it's very, very standard, Redux state management. And you can get a Redux Chrome extension that allow you to browse the application state of OpenCRVS at any given time. And that's very useful because you can see in Chrome the value of offline country config. So if you use the Redux Chrome extension, you will see state, application state tab, and you'll see this property offline. And then if you expand offline, and you'll see another property called offline data. You can also see user details there. That was the other property I said we have access to. So offline data, and you can see essentially the form has access to all of this stuff. So it uses locations to populate those administrative selects. And config, offline country config, this is where you can find all of your application settings. And the setting that we're interested in is birth late registration target. We can see that's equal to 365 days. So in my conditional, I can access this property and access the birth date and decide whether to show or hide the reason for late registration select. Okay, so I'm going to use that property to decide if this field should display or not. So I've written some code. Now, the thing that you must be aware about the conditional expression, whatever expression you write, is it must be written in CommonJS. Okay, so you cannot use any kind of library to write your conditional expression. It's got to be pure JavaScript. So here is my expression that I'm going to use as my conditional. So I'm going to get today's date. I am going to get the property of child's birth date. So I mentioned we have access to values for all the values on that page. And I'm going to create a new date called event date plus late registration target. Then I'm going to get the 365 days property from the offline country config. So first of all, I check, does that exist? Is it not null? Because I think the first time the page renders, that's probably going to be null and then it populates. So you need to handle the null case. So does it exist? If it does exist, then get config.birth.late registration target constant. Get that constant. And then I can set the date of event date plus late registration target equal to the date for that value plus 365 days. And then I can check, is today's date less than that? Okay, is today's date less than that calculated value? If so, hide the field. Okay, so all of this needs to go into that conditional expression line here in a string, a single line. So because this expression is passed to eval, so you may be aware of the eval function in JavaScript. You can pass a string to it and it will execute whatever is in that string. So let me prepare that line. So that's what's going to go into my expression. Okay, so I'm now going to test this conditional. So if I go back to the application and look at the child's page, at the moment I still see the question, and this is because I need to do some more code to check that the date of birth entered is valid first before as an additional conditional. So I want to check, first of all, is it valid? If it is, then proceed to the next conditional step. So the date, I'm going to put in a valid date. Today's date is the 12th of February 2024. So if I put in, say, the 13th of February 2023, it should disappear, which it does. Okay, and then if I change that date to, say, the 12th of February 2023, it will come back. So this is my conditional now working to look at the offline country config, get the delayed registration time, and then use that combined with some JavaScript to determine today's date to show or hide that field. So the next thing I need to do is check the validity of the date of birth before applying the conditional. So to do that, I'm going to use a regular expression. So here is a regular expression that checks the date format is correct. So I've got a regular expression that checks the first part of that. If I was to log values.childBirthDate, which you can do, you could add in a log here, console.log values.childBirthDate. Whatever you put in here is going to get executed. So you could then see that this is a string that looks a bit like this. It will look like this: 2024, something like that. So I'm going to check to make sure, has all the data been entered first before applying the conditional. So I've got a regular expression just to check that is the format of the string. And then at the end of my expression, I'm going to check, so I've assigned this regular expression to this property pattern. I'm going to test that pattern at the end with the actual value of the child's birth date. So let me just add that in now. So I'm going to put that in here as another property. And then at the end, when I'm actually doing the truthy comparison, I'm going to I'm going to test pattern. So I'm going to test the child's birth date against the pattern. And if it's false, so if it doesn't match the pattern, then hide it. Okay, so pattern.test. So I'm going to get the regular expression, test it against the child birth date, or today is less than event date plus late registration target. That should hopefully give me the effect I'm after. So if I just refresh the page, and go to the child's details page. Great. So it's now, I think, going to wait until I have a fully complete date before applying the conditional. Great. So that's exactly what I want. So that's me now added that custom form field into the birth form. And I want to have exactly the same thing in the death form. So if I go to the deceased details page. Actually, it'll be the death event. Yeah, the death event page. If the date of death is too far in the past, then once again show this reason for delayed registration field in there. So I want to, just to save myself writing code that I don't need to, I want to reuse this function in both the birth and the death form. So in future, I'm going to pass a string to it, either birth or death, and then I'm going to change the field ID depending on what the value of that string is, to either be birth.child.childViewGroup.fieldName or death.deathEvent .deathEvent details. So this is all me having some knowledge about how the death form is structured. So if I open up the index file for death, I can see I've got those sections. I've got death event details group, and I'm going to choose a different label for birth or death. I need to pick up the right ID, and I'm going to have a different expression for death, because obviously I want to change this logic to be looking at the event date rather than the birth date. And I'm going to be wanting to get the death config properties, not the birth properties. So I am going to use some code I have written earlier to do that. So if I just copy this over, okay, and I'm going to import this type. Right, so now you can see I've got a function that will take event as a string. If it's equal to birth, then set up the field ID like that, or if it's death, the field ID like this. I've got different labels for birth and death. I've got different expressions for birth and death for the conditional. In this case, I'm getting the death date, sorry, not the event date, the death date, and I'm getting the death registration target. There is no late registration target for death. There's only a single target. And I'm testing the pattern against the death date rather than the childbirth date. So those are the differences. So I'm passing all those properties down to the eventual field configuration. So I'm going to save that, and then I need to go back into my birth form. I need to change how I'm using this function. I'm going to need to pass a string to it. So I'm going to pass birth to it in the birth case. And then I'm going to use exactly the same function in the death form. So I'm going to go to the death form. I'm going to, after the death date, I'm going to place that in here and send death to it. Import that. Okay, and now if I check my death form, I should have that question appearing on the death event details page as well. Okay, date of death. So I think the late registration target is just a month for death. So if I put in the 10th of January 2024, no, it's not a month, maybe it's 45 days. Okay, let me just try the 1st of January. No. Oh, maybe it's still not enough. Let me try the 28th of December 2023. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I'm reusing the same function in both the birth and the death form. So there we go. That's me added a custom field. Now, another thing to notice is what's going on in your logs. Just to show you, how do I find, if I wanted to put the value of this onto my certificate, what is the certificate handlebar for any custom fields? So there's another video all about certificate configuration where you'll see we use handlebars.js to add properties like this into SVG code to go in the certificates. And there is a file for each event which shows you all the possible handlebars that are built into OpenCRVS for all the required or optional fields that we give you by default. But if you're making your own custom ones, then you need to look into your terminal to get those. So here you can see I'm in the country config service that's running in terminal, and you can see every time you add a custom field, the handlebar will log. So that's where you can find your custom field handlebars should you need to put that onto a certificate. So I think that is pretty much everything you need to know when you want to customize your registration forms. I've talked about the pages that you need. I've talked about where the code is, how to change things vertically, how to create custom field, how to change addresses. I've talked about how to change conditionals. One thing I haven't talked about is how to change validations. So validations are written in a very similar way to conditionals. There are a lot of validation scripts built into OpenCRVS core. So I will show you that. So if you look at the core repository, that's OpenCRVS core, and you go to packages, client, source, I think it is utils, validate, yes, validate. Then in here you'll see there are a lot of built-in validator functions. Is a valid date format, minimum length, valid length, is less or equal to, is regular expression matched. There's really lots and lots of different validators you can use in your form config. Email address format, phone number format, is date not in future, is date not in past. Lots and lots and lots of validators. So you should have pretty much every validator that you need. If you don't, you can always open a pull request or let us know and we can build one for you. But you can also build them yourself, because so you use these just like you use conditionals. You'll notice example default, in the default validation conditionals file, you'll see examples of validators being used. For example, here, parent birth date validators. We've got operation, that's the name of the function, and then you can pass parameters to it in an array. So you can customize validations that way. Or you can create your own. So there is another folder you should be aware of, which is, let me see, custom validation conditionals. So inside the common folder, we actually have a handler that will return these validators to every validation that you write in custom validators.ts. These functions will get loaded into the client, and then you can use them. So if you want to write your own ones, you can do it here. So a validator function will return nothing if it's valid. If it's invalid, it will be expecting to receive a message descriptor. What's the validation message that should be shown? So that is what are you going to see here. Okay, so when you're writing a validator function, make sure that you return a message descriptor for the invalid state. Okay, so this is where you can write lots of custom ones, and that's how you use validators. So there is one more thing called preview groups, which you might be interested in. So preview groups, you'll probably notice them in the code being used at the bottom of some sections. So for example, if we look at the birth form, you can see there's a preview groups array, and it's saying child name in English as a preview group. What's that all about? Well, that is about how should certain fields combine on the review page for kind of previewing, reviewing that data, because this was just a user experience design decision. But for example, if I type in my name here, when we get to the final review page, the design team wanted the full name to kind of render nicely like that, full name. So we're taking the value of the first name and the last name field and sticking them together, and that's how we get this rendering of full name on the review page. So that's what preview groups are. So in case you're wondering what that is. We've tried to organize these fields, these files pretty in the best way possible. We can always improve them, but we tried to make it what you see is what you get. So you'll see that there are some required sections, required fields and optional fields. These are all the default ones. So the ones which are required, we really strongly recommend you don't change them because it could affect functionality in the application. And optional ones, you can delete them if you don't want them. They're just there for you because from our research, we know that those are generally common questions that are asked. So if you can reuse them, then please do. Otherwise, create your own custom ones. And yeah, take a look at the form configuration files. Take a look at how some of the other input fields are created, such as selects, get nationality, for example. You can see that options for that are coming from a built-in resource in core countries, but there are some selects which you can also totally customize. So for example, occupation's a good one. Let me get that. Get occupation. You can see here, education. I just say education. Okay, education is a select, and that we have all these options that you can edit. So you can change these. We've used some standard ISO labels, or we've sometimes used Fire standard for some of these options. You can change the value to anything you like. You can see all sorts. This is where you would edit select options. And I think is there anything else I need to say? Oh yes, the documents. So when you get to the documents page, this is a required section. Let's say you want to change the documents that are being asked to upload. Then you can find that in the required sections file, and you'll see all of the configuration for documents. So these are the fields. You can delete these selects if you don't want them. This is actually a custom uploader input field, so it allows you to kind of upload. You'll get the link of the file, you can click that, you'll see a preview of the file. So this is a very special input field, but you can have as few of these as you want. You have to have a document section. You can't not have a document section, but it could contain one document if you wanted it to. And you can see how we've configured all of them. You can change all the options, whatever you need to do. So that's where you'd edit the document section. All right, I can't think of anything else you need to know about form configuration at this time. At the moment, birth and death are ready for you to use. Marriage is currently there. You can use it for proof of concept. You can enable that in application settings, but the marriage form is still in beta, so you can't use marriage in production just now. We still have some work to do. We have to complete marriage analytics, marriage searching, things like this. So marriage is just there as an example. We will be completing marriage in the next release but one. I think it's due in 1.6. All right, well, thank you very much for your time, and hopefully you've understood a lot about form configuration. Thank you.